evening tonight. We're very privileged to have Eliot Coleman come and talk to us about organic farming, and he's certainly in the forefront of that movement and what it means and how he sees the future of organic farming. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Eliot and thank him for sharing his knowledge with us.
When the Nearings were alive, I got to wander around this house a lot, and you should look at the book titles. It's a very eclectic selection. But they had a particular interest in UFOs, and there's a whole UFO section there. And Helen told me that this leftist journal in New York that Scott wrote a column for every month was just petrified that one month the column was going to be about UFOs. He never did that. So, how did I get here? How did I become an organic farmer from suburbia with a master's degree in literature? There was this point in my life, which my mother later referred to as when you went crazy, when I had read this book called Living the Good Life by Scott and Helen Nearing. And in addition to being a teacher, I was a passionate adventurer, rock climbing, whitewater kayaking, mountaineering. And there was something about what they wrote, the idea of living in the woods and growing your own food and surviving, that sounded like an adventure, which is what got me into it. I came to visit them first in 1967, and we got along very well, and I loved what they were doing up at the old place. And then in 1968, I decided, okay, we're going to bite the bullet and do this. We came over and to see him again as we were driving around visiting real estate agents. And Helen said, well, heck, they weren't using the back half of their farm. Why didn't they sell that to me? And Scott thought it was about 50 acres, and he didn't think, since it was all covered with spruce and fir trees and rocks and everything, that it wasn't worth more than $10 an acre. And Helen thought we should pay a little bit more than that, so we made somewhat of a contribution to seriousness. And she said she thought $2,000 would be a fair price. And my first wife and I calculated what they'd paid for the land 20 years before and deducted the value of the house and added in a 4% cost of living index, and we were offering $2,500. So this is one of these rare times when the buyers are offering more than either of the sellers are willing to take. Along with that book, which is what got me here and got me onto this piece of land, which came out to $33 an acre by the time we worked it all out, there were a lot of other influences back in those days. Rachel Carson had written her book, and people were beginning to think about this sorts of stuff. But the thing that got to me, it was really embarrassing the way the chemical companies all treated Rachel Carson and tried to put her down. But the primary pesticide prior to DDT was something called lead arsenate. Now, DDT may finally break down and go away, but lead and arsenic, these are elements, they're in the soil forever. And even those of us who had never farmed before couldn't imagine an agriculture stupid enough to spread lead and arsenic on people's food before they ate it. So we got into it with great enthusiasm. So what is this thing called organic that I got involved with? Right now, it's a sales label, and the industrial food companies are all over it because they can make far more money than they can selling the usual junk stuff. And that wasn't the case back when I started. Nobody even thought that there would be all this certification and main thing we encountered was that this whole idea was a threat to the status quo. Oh my gosh, there are these people say you don't need to use these things. Modern science has come up with this. How do you dare say you're not going to use this? How can you object to this? I mean, I can't tell you the abuse that went on, the anti-scientific ranting that all these guys were doing. And I remember one experience at a university. Some very brave professor had got me invited to give a talk. And I'd made some point, and this man in the front row said, well, that's absolutely ridiculous. I don't know why we're discussing organic farming. Everybody knows it doesn't work. And I said, Dean Smith, would you be so kind as to share with me the data upon which you're basing that statement? And he said, well, there isn't any data. No one's ever been stupid enough to investigate this because it's such a ridiculous idea. And I said, I see, Dean Smith, is that the usual standard of academic inquiry that applies here at the university? These guys were walking right in on that. They were just so convinced that we had nothing that they wanted to have anything to do with. But what they were ignoring was that this was really nothing new. And I have here a copy of the 1938 yearbook of the U.S. Department of Agriculture. And this came out when Henry Wallace, who eventually became Roosevelt's vice president, was the Secretary of Agriculture. I could republish this today as an organic farming textbook. Every one of the articles in here is talking about green manures, cover crops, crop rotation, mixing livestock, everything that is really at the basis of good organic farming. And so here was this book, which probably should have been in every one of those university libraries, and they were trying to pretend that it was some sort of heresy because they bought in to the chemical game. A little more on history here. Did the 60s hippies really invent all these ideas out of whole cloth? The idea that you could get by without pesticides and all of these things. A book, 1893, by a well-known English physician. And he wrote in this, 1893, farmers and gardeners will tell you that chemical fertilizers have got no bottom in them, that their use is, so to say, a speculation. With organic refuse, however, the case is entirely different, and the effect of the application of organic matter to the soil is plainly discernible for 3 or 4 years, until finally these organic matters become fertile humus, which is the only permanent source of wealth in any country. That's 1893. 1898, this is another book published in England by a farmer. Let me now briefly enumerate the other effects of humus. It not only supplies nitrogen, which means you don't need to buy it, but as it decomposes, renders available some of the phosphorus and potash in the soil. The chemist really knows nothing of agriculture, for otherwise he would first of all inquire whether the farmer does make full use of all the natural resources at his disposal. So these weren't ideas just thought up by the 60s hippies. They actually began in the 1890s among the health-oriented food reform movement in Germany. And these people had noticed that the food wasn't tasting as good, and they were a little suspicious, obviously, that maybe lead and arsenic were a good idea to put on the food. And they actually began the whole idea of farming naturally. But what about this super weird idea that if you grow food this way, you don't need to spray because you're not going to have pests? Even as far back as 1793, in a letter to his daughter, Thomas Jefferson wrote, "I suspect that the insects which have harassed you have been encouraged by the feebleness of your plants, and that has been produced by the lean state of the soil. Wow. How did he know that back in 1793? Rodale was even alive then. Erasmus Darwin, who was Charles' grandfather, wrote in 1800 that the leaves of a fruit tree damaged by insects were, quote, previously out of health, which occasioned them to supply a proper situation for those insects which molest them. But these are scientist types and government types. What about farmers? Here's a book written in 1870 by a market gardener in Paris, Vincent Gresson. For vegetable growing, chemical fertilizers don't do all that one wants. They stimulate the plant and produce quantity, but to the detriment of quality. In principle, insect pests only attack weak, sickly plant specimens lacking proper nutrition. In proof of this, I offer the market gardens of Paris, where vegetable growing has reached perfection. One does not see pest problems in Parisian market gardens, wherever copious compost use and rational crop rotations are practiced by the growers. Wow. So these ideas have some history to them. This is not anything that came out of nowhere. So, how did things progress after all these professors were yelling at us? Well, it turned out that at Christmas in 1978, Berglund, who was the Secretary of Agriculture, went home to his farm in the upper Midwest. And at a Christmas party, he was talking to his neighbor. And all of this came about because his neighbor was extremely politically conservative and farmed 5,000 acres and told Secretary of Agriculture Berglund that he and his son had converted their farm to organic farming 5 years ago, and they were now making more money and having fewer problems. Well, Berglund was enough of a decent person and scientist that he then assigned the USDA to do a study in 1979 and 1980. And it was called Report and Recommendations on Organic Farming. And this is the way it was published. And while they were working on it, I got a phone call from a man named Anson Bertrand, who was part of the agricultural research part of the USDA. And he'd heard that I had been running organic farm study tours in Europe, which I had been since 1974. And he said, is there any way we can find out what the Europeans are doing in organic farming to make it part of our study? And I said, easy enough, let me set up a 10-day tour of the best farms over there. And so he said, okay. And they had 4 people, scientists, who were doing this work. And I mentioned this to Bob Rodale at Rodale Press and Dick Hardwood, his lead scientist. And the next day I got a phone call from Dick saying, Bob and I want to come too. It was great. So we had these 4 USDA scientists and the 2 of the top people from Rodale, and we had a rented van that we were driving around to visit these different farms in. And the fascinating thing was that Bob Rodale loved to drive, so every morning after breakfast he would go get the van and meet us at the front door of the hotel. So we're the only European tour group with a millionaire chauffeur. It was really fascinating. So, on this tour, their minds were slowly being blown more and more as they said, oh my God, these guys, can they really? And they just, each farm impressed them even more. But the best thing, the story I remember most, one of the 4 researchers was on loan to the USDA. He was a dean of entomology at a major Midwestern university. And so we're talking to the farmer through the translator on the side of the field, and the entomologist is out walking into the field and just sweeping his hand over the top of the crops to see what insects come. You see entomologists do this all the time. And we kept talking to the farmer, but we noticed that finally he was just standing there looking stunned. And we looked over at him, he said, we can't do this well with chemicals. This is the dean of entomology at a major university. And I always had the feeling it was like I'd taken a Catholic into the Baptist church and God said, hi, I live here. I mean, his religion was truly, but, you know, he was part of this study, and they finally you know, said all the right things. Well, so these are just introductions to it. What about me and farming? The first book I read was not by Rodale or anything. It was a very dry textbook written in 1936 by a professor of microbiology, Selman Waxman. He was at Rutgers. And it's called Soil Microbiology. And this taught me more and inspired me more than anything else, because I had read some little mention that in a teaspoonful of fertile soil there were millions of live organisms. And I remember thinking, that is the most amazing thing. They're microscopic. That's the most amazing thing I've ever heard. Well, dry and scientific as this was, he went over what's going on in the soil with all these microorganisms. Their favorite food is organic matter, and in the process of decomposing the organic matter, they're making available all the nutrients that the plant needs. Now, nowadays, this is nothing new. We're always talking about the soil microbiome and the human microbiome, and people are talking about, but boy, this was not common stuff back then. But when I read this was really my introduction to what was going on. And it wasn't about farming, but it was about what goes on in the soil that makes plants grow. So this was the very cool book. Okay, so what is happening to confuse things? Because everybody got into the game by reading Rodale's Organic Gardening magazine, the concepts of organic gardening became common. And if you have an organic garden, you don't have an organic farm, and you're not doing the type of things a farmer would do, but you're going out and buying all these organic fertilizers, so you're getting a bone meal, or you're getting some combination of different things. And so when the detractors wanted to say that this was ridiculous, they could easily say, well, of course this is ridiculous. There isn't enough bone meal for all the farms. There isn't enough blood meal for all the farms. And there certainly isn't enough manure for all the farms. Well, the problem was what they were looking at was organic gardening. But organic farming is done on a totally different scale. And a good organic farm is not buying any inputs. And so if you want to ask whether you can do it on thousands of acres or millions of acres, the techniques that a good organic farm is using are available to any farmer anywhere. But they have a real flaw. They're self-resourced. And so the technique we use on our farm is an old English word, ley farming, L-E-Y, and L-E-Y was an Anglo-Saxon word for temporary pasture. And from about the 1600s on, British farmers would have the cattle on the pasture for a few years, and then they would plow it up, and they could get a few years free crops off of it, because first off, the roots of all those grasses and legumes had put all sorts of organic matter into the soil, plus nitrogen, and the cattle grazing on that. And what they found was if land was in grass clover pasture for 4 years grazed by animals, when you plowed it up, it was practically like virgin soil again. Well, my gosh, if you are selling fertilizers, you don't want anybody to know about that. And that is exactly the flaw that has made it possible for the naysayers to keep putting down organic farming, because they're scared to death. That they don't want anybody to know that you can do this, but this is exactly what your good farmers have been doing. They haven't been buying in bone meal, but they have been running a crop rotation. They have been running green manures, cover crops, all of which put organic matter into the soil. And if you put organic matter into the soil, its breakdown processes liberate the other nutrients, make them available. And like I say, 1938 yearbook, this has been known forever, and this is what the large-scale farms are doing. But we're still being told, well, it's a cute system, but it can't feed the world. Well, if we ever run into resource depletion, organic farming is the only thing that will feed the world. Because chemical farming isn't feeding the world at the moment, no matter what they say. It's all the small peasant farmers around the world who are using the type of techniques that have fed them and their families for generations. And the power of, these guys are good, the power of telling lies by stating as a fact what you want to be true even though it isn't true is very effective, and these guys have been doing that with amazing success for a long time. I just had some other stuff here. Hang on. Oh yeah, so I had a book here I wanted you to look at. So what are you going to do about the fact that there's a lot of people out there telling you stories? This is an excellent book. I suggest you go get a copy. It's entitled Formerly Known as Food. Great title, but it explains what's going on in the food system and how the food processors and everything, even though they slap the name organic on there, that you're just not getting what you thought you were getting, what you're supposed to get. And what you need to do then is ask what I always call, having seen the movie The Field of Dreams, everybody saw Field of Dreams? I call it the Kevin Costner question. And when Kevin doesn't get to go into the cornfield with everybody else, he turns to the guy and he says, wait a minute, I don't want to act like this, but what's in it for me? And then of course he gets to play catch with his dad, which is a very warm moment and all as well. But I really suggest that when new technologies come along, and GMOs are a perfect example, that you ask the Kevin Costner question. What's in it for me? What is in it for you in GMOs? The farmer doesn't have to cultivate. That's not in it for you, because he's spraying glyphosate all over the place. The seeds for these crops have been genetically modified in a way that has never been known before. This is the key thing, the key question you want to be asking, what's in it for me? So where do you find good food? Where do you know to go? Keep it small. Who was it? Some writer recently said, don't eat anything with more than one ingredient or something, which is probably pretty good. But there was an Austrian economist, Leopold Kohr, and his statement was, whenever something is wrong, something is too big. And that's exactly what goes on in farming. You get 1,000 acres, you get 5,000 acres, 10,000 acres, and even if you wanted to on that scale, it's hard to do the type of good farming. So your best, your most dependable people are the people who are doing it on a small scale. Now, what is going on then in general? Well, a group of us have been in a big battle with the U.S. Department of Agriculture. The USDA, since the year 2002, has controlled the word organic and is in charge of organic certification. Since 2002, the USDA has been trying very hard to destroy the whole organic movement, because when this study came out, a few of my organic buddies sort of said, see, we were right. And they didn't enjoy that at all. And people have been saying that to them ever since. So we've been in a battle with them because they are really controlled by the large food companies. And so if you go now into any store that's offering you organic strawberries, raspberries, blueberries, they're no longer grown in the soil. They're hydroponic. And that's because these big companies like Driscoll's have figured out how to grow even those things as hydroponic fruits. If you go into a store now and go to the organic section and you buy tomatoes, peppers, eggplants, they're all hydroponic. And this is something that just should not have happened. But these people bought off the USDA. Basically, they bought off the USDA. How are they doing this? This is great. Calling hydroponic organic is illegal in Mexico, in Canada, and in Holland. And the majority of the supposedly organic tomatoes, peppers, eggplants, etc., are coming in from Mexico, Canada, and Holland. Because when they ship them here, they're suddenly organic. Now, there's a group of us who've been raising a stink about this with absolutely no effect. In fact, actually we did have an effect. The USDA, in a recent publication, rewrote history. This is great. If you control the media, you can rewrite history. And they said, hydroponics has always been allowed in organics since the start. Now, there is a group called the Organic Trade Association, and they represent the big boys who want to put that name on boxes so they can get twice as much money for it. If you get a hold of the Organic Trade Association and you tell them that Eliot said you guys have been pushing hydroponics, you're not protecting us, they will tell you we are entirely opposed to hydroponics. The reason they can do that is because they and the hydroponic industry realize that the public is not clamoring for hydroponics. So the hydroponic industry now calls their stuff container grown. And so the OTA will tell you, oh no, there's nothing wrong with container grown, but we're against hydroponics. If they just change the goddamn name. What is the container? Well, if you're growing blueberries hydroponically, the container is probably a pot yay big filled with coconut coir. But the containers in some places, are just the size of a little cube. Container grown. So how have these guys managed to do this? Well, there is a huge startup out in California called Plenty. And they are copying what's been going on in warehouses along the East Coast and in the upper Midwest, where old warehouses are being repurposed into growing your salads. And of course there's no sunlight in warehouses, so they have LED lights on benches, and everything there is being grown hydroponically. And how does Plenty have so much power that they can, with these other people, do this? They got, I think, $300 million in funding. I think $100 million of that came from Jeff Bezos.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And my wife Barbara used to write a weekly gardening column for the Washington Post. And the first time she wrote about her objection to hydroponics, she got away with it. The second time, the editors sort of hinted, well, that's a political, you're supposed to write about gardening, and we have people to write about politics. And the third time, she's no longer writing for them, because I think Jeff did not enjoy one of his writers damning what he was doing with his $100 million. So what's going on? You guys know Leonard Cohen's songs. Well, he has a great song in his gravelly voice. Everybody knows the dice are loaded. Everybody rolls with their fingers crossed. Everybody knows the war is over. Everybody knows the good guys lost. And that's exactly what has been happening. The dice are loaded, and there is now a group called the Real Organic Project. And they're not as revolutionarily immature as I am. They are trying to be adults and go about this properly. And so they are coming up with an add-on label. And all of their farmers will be required to certify with the USDA. And if they do, then they'll be able to put this add-on label on that says that they're better than that. As an old 60s hippie, I just found that I would have to deal with the USDA intolerable. But according to the rules, if you're not certified, you can't use the word organic. So, you know, I'm pretty good at raising trouble. So I invented a new word. You guys, a new word is a neologism. If you know your Greek, neo means new, logos means word. Neologism is a totally new word that anyone's never heard of before. And this is an 11-letter word, and it's spelled REALORGANIC, which if you can spell sideways like that, spells real organic. No one's ever seen it before. And if you drove by the entrance to our farm, you saw a sign. It didn't say certified, it said guaranteed real organic. Now I was just at a conference raising hell and presenting all of this, and I said, you know, to the farmers there, if 50 or 100 of you guys did the exact same thing, there's no way they can put this genie back in the bottle, because we would be out. I don't know if they're going to do it, but we are going to do it, because what has been going on is pure fraud, absolutely fraud. The USDA is being consciously fraudulent. And of course there's no way to stop them, because they're the government. And we've complained to Senator Leahy, because it was his office that helped get the original thing in. And politicians don't want to have anything to do with this. We talked to Shelley, and she, you know, they don't want to, what shall I say, waste their political capital on small fires like this. So anyway, that's what's been going on out there, and yeah. So the whole idea, the negative stuff, and you'll always read some article in The Economist saying that organic is bunk. There is so much data out there, so many studies like the IASTED, the ASTED study that looked into agriculture all over the world, that said the only answer for feeding people in the future is to farm organically. Or maybe we can use a word other people use, agroecology, agroecologically. You don't have to have it with the I's dotted and the T's crossed. But that is the thing. So why is this so important? Why do I object to letting the hydro people call their junk organic? Because our future, the future of everybody on this planet, is depending upon a few inches of biologically active soil that covers the planet. And chemical farming is destroying that, and has been ever since it started. The CAFOs, where all these animals are locked up in huge feedlots, they are, besides mistreating the animals, turning manure into a waste product. And hydro is just scummy. You actually want your food grown with artificial lights? This is just, anyway. Would people object if something like this happened somewhere else? Something that had once been natural was suddenly artificial? I would like to think there would be a hell of a stink if the Food and Drug Administration allowed Nestle to call their artificial formula breast milk. But that's basically what these guys are doing, calling their vegetables vegetables. So, how do you do something about this? Next time you're in the supermarket and you see the organic tomatoes, ask the produce manager, are these hydroponic? And I guarantee you 99 out of 100 produce managers will say, no, they're organic. They have no idea. They have no idea. And even though at the Blue Hill Co-op, I've mentioned this to them, I don't know where they're getting their stuff. A good friend of mine, Dave Chapman in Vermont, has 3 acres of glass greenhouses growing in the soil. He's probably the best organic tomato grower in the world. And he sells his stuff at the co-op. But at other times, I guarantee you, even though they don't want it to be, their strawberries and their blueberries and their blackberries and their raspberries are hydroponic. And I hinted about this to the produce manager, and he says, well, I can't get them anywhere else. So what do you do when your whole system has been subverted like that? You raise hell.
Yeah.
You put up a sign at the end of your driveway that says guaranteed real organic, and you wait for the black helicopter. But anyway, so this is just to tell you that organic, despite what the naysayers are going to try and tell you, the ideas behind this have been part of agriculture forever. They're as sound as any production idea. They can be done on a large scale and a small scale, and there is everything to the advantage of the eaters out there for this to become the common way of growing food. And I will take questions.
Eliot, so hydroponically grown products do not require any label that suggests that they are such.
And they would never label them because, have you ever seen people clamoring for more hydroponics? Yeah. No, these guys, this has truly been devious, but they're putting our name, and they're, and long before I came along, the people who started this game, the reason organic got a good name was these people were honest, they were concerned, they were definitely interested in producing the highest quality nutritional food they could produce. So whether anything will change in trade winds or the co-op, I don't know, but go in and raise hell. Maybe the word will get back to somebody. Yes?
Isn't it true that you could, if you were on a diet of rice and beans and vegetables, that you could feed like 8 or 10 people for what someone who was a carnivore on a meat diet?
Yeah, that depends on how you're raising your carnivores. And Francis Moore Lepay, made some very good points on that, but that was back when all the meat was being raised in feedlots and fed grain. All those cattle, grain makes them ill, and so that's why they're dosed with low levels of antibiotics.
Right.
The food they're meant to eat is grass, and if I have a steer up on my farm and it's in my pasture eating grass, first off, there's no CO2, and we're told the CO2 from animals is destroying the world. No, there's no CO2 because the grass took CO2 out of the air and the animal is eating it and putting it back in. There's no transport because it's local, and there are plenty of people around here producing local grass-fed animals. Yes, if you take the enormous amount of grain that you have to feed to a steer in a feedlot to produce beef, you could feed a lot of people on it. But that has been condemned by wise people ever since it first came about. And there was a quote by Wendell Berry about the whole feedlot and things. And he said, Yeah. U.S. farm experts are really geniuses. They can take a solution, and the solution was having the animals raised on the same farm with the rest of the crops. They can take a solution and divide it neatly into two problems. The two problems are all the animals in a feedlot where then there's no way to use the manure, and all the grain farms that are then using chemicals and shipping their grain to the feedlot. But I love that they can take a solution and divide it neatly into two problems. Yeah. Yes?
I don't mean to put you on the spot because I realize your background isn't necessarily in genetic modification, but I have an internal family argument about GMOs, and I believe that the research that was done many years ago about how it's actually bad for us to consume GMOs is
To eat what?
is valid. To consume genetically modified
Uh-huh.
food. And I have some very intelligent people in my family who claim otherwise. Do you have any data I can direct them to that's current that would
Yeah,
help me
it
win
just
this argument?
ask them the Kevin Costner question.
Yeah.
If there
Right.
is a
Yeah.
chance that these things are bad for the person eating it and the planet, I mean, the word out now on glyphosate is just frightening, then what's in it for us? We're allowing farmers to trash the planet for their benefit. Oh, they don't have to cultivate because this stuff kills all the weeds. That's nice, you know.
Yeah.
There used to be jokes about the Midwestern farmers. The crop rotation was corn, beans, and Florida. No. Now it's, I don't know what, but they, you know, if you're using those chemicals, you hardly have to get off the lazy boy and go do anything.
Yeah.
That would be my first thing, because with any scientific thing, the people who are selling the product, boy, they can always find some scientist who will, the same way, what's his name in DC has Giuliani working for him now. Anyway, yes.
So in order for more people to be able to eat organic food, there has to be more organic farmers on the land. And for my generation of farmers, one of the biggest issues is land access. And I watched peer after peer leave farming because of not being able to access land, and especially for there to be, you know, farmers spread out beyond areas like this where there may still be affordable land. So I'm wondering what you see as the future of organic farming in that way.
Yeah, well, I was fortunate that the Narings were kind enough to sell me land for $33 an acre, which is the only reason I'm here. Otherwise, I would not be on the Maine coast. The National Young Farmers Coalition has been working on that, and they have a number of interesting ideas that if you go into farming, the government will forgive your student loan debt, so you don't have that on top of also having to work in a medium income industry rather than a high income industry. And unless there's major changes, unless there's more people like the Narings. Right after Helen died, I was giving a talk at the Common Ground Fair, and I just mentioned how fortunate I've been that the Narings have been that generous to me. And that should have been a very friendly audience, and I looked around and I said, if any of you are interested in helping young people get into agriculture, maybe you could do the same thing. And I could see about 50% of the eyes hardening up at that suggestion. So even in that audience, the idea that you would pass up a profit on the land, there's something immoral about that. It has always bothered me that if you're a renter and you lose your job and can no longer pay your rent, there's no place you can legally lay your head. And there should be. I mean, that's a screamingly immoral situation, but that happens to be the reality of the world we've created. The land trusts are doing a good job trying to save farmland and make it available, and Paul Birdsoil in Blue Hill did a lot of good protecting all the land along the Penobscot Ridge there, and there are a lot of young people farming that thanks to his effort. I guess we just need more of that, because that's a tough question, but a good question. Yes?
Eliot, as you've traveled the world, which countries do this the best? In terms of
Which countries what?
Which countries do this the best in terms of producing real food?
Oh, Switzerland, Germany, and France. There's some darn good organic farmers in Italy, but the Italians sometimes play fast and loose with,
Denmark, Holland.
yeah. But on those European farm tours, the Swiss and the Germans were and these, on my first trip in '74, they were far ahead of us. It was amazing. A lot of the techniques that we all use today, like flame weeding and things like that, I saw them the first time over there. I mean, it was amazing what they had. And there were small scale equipment manufacturers that were making tools specifically for organic farming. You know, we've caught up now, and I don't think there's the differences there were back then. But yeah, I learned a lot over there. This book, I talk about the French farmers, and the guys in Paris in the 1850s on, and a descendant of that system. And it was all based on, in the 1800s, going to the stables in Paris, loading your wagon with horse manure, taking it back to your little holding, and the little holdings were about 1.5 acres. And 6% of the city of Paris was in gardens back then. And it was self-sufficient in food, and it was amazing. And yeah, the horse manure is great stuff, because they would first use it as it decomposes, it gives off a lot of heat. And so you put soil on top of it and put a cold frame on top of that. And they were producing melons and cucumbers in May in the Parisian climate, and producing solids all winter. And it was pretty neat. And once the decomposition was over and broke down, it's probably the best possible fertilizer for vegetable growers. Yeah, and I had one other wonderful quote here from William Morris. My mother wasn't the only one who thought I was crazy, but you know, if you're a small farmer, you're doing a lot more work for far less return than people think is normal. And William Morris referred to artists and people who do a lot of work because they love what they're doing as those people who find a conscious, sensuous pleasure in the work itself. And I would say that all your good small farmers are doing that because there's something immensely satisfying, a conscious, sensuous pleasure in producing a product that is benefiting all the people who are eating your food. Yes, sir.
I was just getting to that. It's like, what about you? What about your life? It's more difficult to do what you've done than big
Well, no,
farmers.
see, I was the nutcase adventurer. I wasn't going to start on... I lectured in Iowa once, and I came back home and I told Barbara I'd seen something out of Iowa I'd never seen before. She said, "What's that?" I said, "They got this stuff called soil. You should see it. It looks like chocolate fudge mix, and it's got it everywhere." So rather than doing something simple like that, yeah, we started with trees that we have to cut down and grub out the stumps, and then we had to roll out the rocks, and we had about 2 inches of topsoil. And some of the hippies working with me back then, it was great, because after we pry a stump out of the ground and roll it off. I said, wait a minute, don't roll that off. Take the back of the axe and knock that soil off of there. And they said, why? Because that's all the soil we got. So anyway, I think it's a great story from the point of view of if we do it right, we won't starve. If you can turn what we started with into what we have now, that really grows fantastically flavorful and nutritious vegetables, you can do it anywhere. It was the adventurer part of me that wanted to. Back when I was rock climbing, very often friends would meet us on top for lunch. Why are we going up this way? It was a good feeling to do it, I guess. It was a good feeling to turn.
But you kind of, I told you earlier on, I saw so many of your videos. I binge watched your videos for like 6 hours. Around the 70s and 80s, I think.
Are those from our TV show?
Yes.
Oh, we were young
The
and beautiful
compost.
back then. That was irate.
But you say that, I mean, it's very easy, and it's a great advantage financially for farmers to do this whole modern farming with pesticides. But I mean, you've enjoyed every minute of your life in creating from nothing to create. Every day you go out and there's joy.
Yes.
The argument against commercial farming is every day you don't have to leave your lazy boy, as you said.
Yeah.
And there's no joy. So
Yeah.
I think the biggest value is you as an example of how your life can be intertwined with food production and made happy as the food you produce.
When I walk out of the house in the morning and I look at the beauty that we've managed to create, it's endorphins are in there heavily at that point. It's pretty cool. I would miss it if I hadn't done that. Anyway, thank you all very much. It's been